Starting. All righty, welcome. Good evening, everybody. We'll start shortly, just a couple of minutes. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll give it another minute or so. I see people entering, which is awesome. Welcome, one and all. Oh, I see some familiar names. Oh, that's awesome. Welcome, folks. We'll start in a minute. For those just joining us. Good evening, everybody. We'll start in a minute. We are recording this webinar, just a reminder. All righty. Good evening, everybody. Once again, I'd like to inform you that we are recording this special webinar. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to thank my colleague Avis Koyman and Srushti Suresh for all their assistance behind the scenes that makes this and other webinars possible. I would like to mention that our next special webinar, titled Playing by the Rules, Israel's Palestinian Arab Citizens, featuring Professor Sami Smuha, will take place next Monday, December 2nd, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for a fantastic talk titled Pushing Back and Leaning In on Israel, Jewish Activist Movements and Advocacy Organizations on the Left and Right since October 7th, featuring Dr. Elizabeth Stein, whom I'll present momentarily. I'll just frame it for a moment and say that Hamas' horrendous terror attack of October 7, 2023, and the subsequent conflict in Gaza and across the region had posed a major challenge for Jewish communities worldwide. For some of them, it served as a galvanizing moment, leading to a pronounced and renowned pro-Israel stance. The unprecedented violence, including the targeting of civilians, evoked a deep sense of vulnerability and solidarity with Israel, reinforcing its role as a safe haven for the Jewish people. Synagogues, advocacy organizations, and grassroots groups mobilized swiftly, organizing rallies, fundraising efforts, and media campaigns to support Israel. For many, the attack underscored the existential threats Israel faces, fostering a more unified and vocal commitment to its defense and security. The very same violent events led other Jewish groups and communities to take a vocal and public stance against Israel's actions in Gaza and other areas. They have criticized Israel's military responses, citing concerns over civilian casualties and advocating for an immediate ceasefire and the protection of human rights. These groups have often framed their activism as rooted in Jewish values of justice and the sanctity of life, challenging the mainstream pro-Israel consensus. Both positions have sparked intense debate within the broader Jewish community, raising questions about identity and collective responsibility, and how these drive activism and advocacy. Such issues will be discussed tonight. And so it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Stein, who holds the postdoctoral fellowship at the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles for 2023-2025. Her research focuses on organized activism and political mobilization concerning Israel among Jews in the United States, France, and Canada since the late 1970s. Her dissertation, which she is now developing into a book manuscript, received an honorable mention from the International Relations and Religion section of the International Studies Association. Dr. Stein also teaches a class on diaspora politics at UCLA's Department of Political Science. She received her doctorate from Queen's University in Canada in August 2023. She has a forthcoming article in French Politics Journal, co-authored with David Hugland, about links between anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism in France. My apologies. Dr. Stein will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor, quote unquote, for questions, comments, and remarks. Please feel free to type those in the designated Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Stein, the virtual floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
Thank you. Eli, can you tell me if things are working on the screen as they were 5 minutes ago?
They're not.
Okay, just give me one moment, please.
There you go. Absolutely. We're here.
Are they working now?
No, we see the notes.
Okay, one moment.
There you go. Fantastic.
Okay.
All righty. And now the floor is really yours. Go ahead, Dr. Stein.
So thank you, Professor Saltzman and Avis Koyman, for inviting me to speak to your community. So my presentation is about organized activism and advocacy among Jews concerning Israel, with a focus on the last year since the beginning of the war in Gaza, and the notion of insecurity as a motivator for action. This talk is based on part of a book manuscript I'm writing called Pushing Back and Leaning In: The Israel Question Among Jews in the United States, France, and Canada. Broadly speaking, when I say pushing back or pushback, I mean organized activism, advocacy, and lobbying among Jews primarily, which criticizes and opposes Israeli government policies and actions related to Palestinians, the occupation and control of the West Bank and Gaza, and settlements. Pushback activism also criticizes and opposes support for Israel from one's own government and from establishment, mainstream, and legacy Jewish organizations, such as the Jewish Federations of North America and the ADL, which are broadly supportive of Israeli government actions and policies, and certainly never openly critical of them. When I say leaning in on Israel, I mean broadly pro-Israel activism, advocacy, and lobbying. The questions which have motivated my research over the last few years have been, why is it that when American Jews are so deeply divided over Israel, the next largest Jewish populations, almost 500,000 Jews in both France and Canada, are not nearly as polarized ideologically and fragmented organizationally? Why does Israel continue to be a point of unity, especially among French Jews, who tend to stand in solidarity with it, and they ostracize any criticism of it or its government? I believe the answer to these questions is multifaceted, with three main interweaving explanations centered on perceptions of insecurity, geopolitics, such as which country is best able to coerce Israeli leaders, and cultural and political norms around ethnic lobbying. I will outline those interweaving explanations later, but I'll say that in this talk, I focus on one of those explanations, different perceptions of insecurity. I'll also discuss how activism and perceptions of insecurity have changed since October 7th. Most of the organizations on the left and right side of the screen are US-based, and I've also shown a few branch or sister organizations in France and Canada. On the right, what I call pushback organizations are Jewish activist and advocacy groups, which have different positions on Israel and Zionism, on if and how their governments should support Israel and its government's actions and policies related to Palestinians, and different policies on whether their own governments should pressure Israel to take concrete steps toward ending the conflict, ending settlement building, and in the last year, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Despite different positions on these issues, these organizations on the right side, pushback organizations, share a few views. First, they share the view that traditional Jewish and Israel advocacy organizations, those on the left, are uncritical and unconditional in their support for Israeli positions and actions related to security. Second, those organizations' support is unconstructive in that it helps to perpetuate Israel's occupation of the West Bank and control of Gaza and morally unjust treatment of Palestinians. And third, that establishment organizations' uncritical, unconditional, and unconstructive support has meant that they have drifted, along with Israel, in a rightward, illiberal, and ethno-nationalist direction, and have thus drifted away from the liberal values and the concern for minority rights that have long characterized American Jews. And in France and Canada, Jews there also. I want to clarify that there's always existed, as we know, Jewish opposition to political Zionism since the beginning of that movement. What makes pushback organizations new is their broad opposition to many policies of the state of Israel and their argument that they, in fact, represent the mainstream opinion of Jews in the United States, and similarly in France and Canada. I'll speak more about those pushback organizations on the right side throughout the talk. The first to be established was among them is American Jews for Peace Now, which was created to support the Israeli organization Shalom Achshav and the New Israel Fund, established around 1980. And the most recent of those is Standing Together, founded in Israel in 2015, which has become very popular in the last year in chapters and support organizations across the United States and several chapters in Canada. So what do these organizations do actively? They call on their respective governments and policymakers to condemn occupation of the West Bank and control of Gaza, condemn settlements and settler violence and the war in Gaza, and call on their policymakers to pressure Israel to renew serious peacemaking. Since 2019, JStreet, Americans for Peace Now, and IfNotNow have called on US Congress to condition military support for Israel on it taking steps toward ending the occupation. These organizations support the electoral campaigns of Congress members and candidates who adopt those positions. So on the left, that's a promotion from Jewish Voice for Peace, and on the right, that is from IfNotNow. Jewish Voice for Peace is an anti-Zionist group founded in '96 and has become more and more popular among American Jews with each flare-up of violence between Israel and Hamas and Palestinians. Since its foundation, it has called on the US to stop supporting Israel diplomatically and with military aid, so long as Israel maintains occupation of the West Bank and control of Gaza. And on the left, that's from IfNotNow, a non-Zionist group of mostly younger Jewish adults who call on American Jews to turn against major Jewish institutions, which, as I said previously, as they say, do not represent the majority view of American Jews. So IfNotNow actually began by members of JStreet U in 2014, who thought that JStreet had gone too mainstream and too aligned with the position of the Democratic Party. So just these two Instagram posts are good examples of pushback organizations calling on American Jews to push back against important and influential, longstanding American Jewish institutions. The Anti-Defamation League and AIPAC, the biggest pro-Israel political action PAC in the country. US-based pushback groups have flourished across the country among liberal Jews of all ages, especially since the breakdown of the Oslo Accords around the year 2000. This broad group of organizations have each had between 20 and 70 chapters across the country at any given points in their lifespans. All have had at least a few paid staff, and many more for the New Israel Fund, and many more for JStreet, the biggest of these groups. And they have several offices or branches across the country. In contrast, the comparable organizations in Canada have experienced little growth. Canada's versions or chapters of JStreet, Peace Now, New Israel Fund, IfNotNow, and Jewish Voice for Peace generally have no staff, apart from New Israel Fund, and a small support base concentrated in Toronto. If you were to compare the average annual revenues of establishment organizations and pushback organizations in both the US and Canada, it would indicate that American Jews are significantly more inclined to support pushback activism, even accounting for its far larger Jewish population. And pushback organizations in France have met with even less success, despite a larger Jewish population than in Canada. Peace Now France, J-Call France, and Une Autre Voix Juive, or Alternative Jewish Voice, each have small support bases entirely in Paris, no staff, and a few events per year. Very different from here, they have virtually no participation from young adults. Among 24 people I interviewed in France, all of whom were active in Jewish community or Israel advocacy organizations, many had never heard of J-Call France, which is France's and Europe's version of JStreet, and it was founded by the same people who founded France's version of Peace Now. So my answer to why American Jews are so much more fragmented organizationally over Israel and inclined to push back against Israel and establishment organizations consists of three interweaving explanations, which focus on, first, perceptions of insecurity; second, the geopolitical significance of each country to Israel. For instance, the immense importance of the US to Israel means that American Jews are more likely to feel their activism and advocacy, if it does influence US policy, can have a real impact on Israeli leaders' actions. And third, different political and cultural norms around ethnicity-based activism. So, reaching out to your government on the basis of ethnic identity or national identity, and different political norms around lobbying in each country. I could talk more about this after the presentation. My overall argument is based on analysis of several existing opinion surveys of Jews in each country and 55 interviews with leaders of Jewish and Israel advocacy organizations across the political spectrum in each country. So I want to focus on the security threat strand of the argument. And I'm going to focus on the American and French cases because they're the cases on the extremes. So I contrast two perceived existential insecurities: perceptions of physical insecurity due to anti-Semitism and anxiety about a community torn apart due to a clash of values between liberal, pluralist values and concern for minority rights, and on the other hand, ethno-nationalist values and concern for the well-being of Jews primarily. So French Jews are the most likely to fear and experience violent anti-Semitism personally. Threats and violence against Jews in France have surged in October 2000 following the beginning of the Second Intifada. And they have remained high, surging with every violent flare-up between Hamas and Israel. Many of us have heard for a long time that anti-Semitism in France is significantly more intense and acutely felt than in the United States. A 2022 survey of the American Jewish Committee in Paris found that 74% of French Jews had experienced at least one anti-Semitic act in their lifetime, and 20% had been physically attacked. A survey of Jewish students in late 2023, just before the war, found that almost half had been insulted for being Jewish in their school or university. In contrast, surveys by American Jewish Committee show that 75% of American Jews have not experienced anti-Semitism between 2014 and 2020, and that is a similar figure for Canadian Jews. French Jews are also more likely to perceive anti-Semitism as a grave threat. Between 2013 and 2018, the share of French Jews who thought it posed a big problem increased from 85% to 95%. In contrast, in the 2000s, less than 30% of American Jews thought anti-Semitism posed a very serious problem. That increased to 40% in 2013 and to 45% 3 years ago, but it's still significantly lower than the figures in France of around 90%. And what else is important is that the predominant French perception of the character of anti-Semitism is different. Most French Jews are likely to believe that anti-Jewish attacks are mostly from Muslims and Arabs, motivated by hate for Israel. That's a very different interpretation from the predominant view in North America, where anti-Semitism is seen as a problem for most of the far right. And that difference is important because the far right concerns itself with domestic society, not Israel, and discriminates against Muslims and Arabs as well as Jews. So not only have Jews in the US generally experienced and feared anti-Semitism less than French Jews, they also have less reason to perceive criticism of Israel as feeding into anti-Semitism. One former director of France's main Central Jewish Federation told me that criticism of Israel among American Jews may be viewed as disloyal and naive, but it's unlikely to be seen as seriously damaging to American Jews or Israel, as we often see here in France. Most of my interviewees in France portrayed anti-Semitism as unrelenting and doubted that there's a viable future for Jewish life in France. And that was not expressed by any of my 30 interviewees in the US and Canada, none of whom portrayed a bleak future for Jewish life in their country. So about 45,000 Jews in France left for Israel between 2000 and 2016. That's nearly 1/10 of its Jewish population over that time. And we know that that's in significant part motivated by fears of anti-Semitism, because surveys show that a large majority of French Jews who seriously considered moving to Israel had previously been harassed for being Jewish, whereas a large majority who had not considered making Aliyah had not been harassed. And you could see that Aliyah among North American Jews is stable at close to 0%. And the gap in the graph is because I don't have data for the year 2015. So American Jews have been more likely, I argue, to feel an altogether different insecurity, one due to a clash of values. For many liberal American Jews, their identity as part of a historically politically progressive community concerned with minority rights is rooted in their own minority group experience and in 20th century American liberalism. Since the late 1970s, that identity became more and more dissonant with a rightward, ethno-nationalist, and illiberal drift in Israel, and with major American Jewish institutions which have not opposed expanding settlements, ongoing military occupation, and as a recent example, did not oppose the 2018 nation-state law in Israel, which we know declared that Israel is the national homeland, not of its citizens per se, but of the Jewish people. So the clash of values I'm talking about is between the liberal, universalist, minority rights values aspect of American Jews' identity and the ethnocentric and Zionist values, which are also facets of many American Jews' identity. That clash, I'm arguing, has pushed many American Jews away from the very institutions that ostensibly represent their concerns and values, but don't actually reflect their self-image back at them, such as ADL and Jewish federations. So for many, pushing back against those institutions reduces the cognitive dissonance caused by this clash of values. In contrast, the messaging of pushback organizations refers explicitly to liberalism, as Eli said in the introduction, refers explicitly to liberalism, pluralism, justice, equality before the law, and minority rights. Pushback organizations characterize their supporters with these terms, and they accuse establishment organizations of betraying these values. So pushing back fulfills an important self-affirmation function for many American Jews. For a good share of Jews who align themselves with particular pushback organizations, doing so is a way to restore or strengthen their sense of being part of a community of like-minded liberal Jews. For one IfNotNow activist, they told me, there was nowhere that felt comfortable for us or that allowed space for people who feel connected to Israel and also deeply opposed to what's happening in Israel. We were trying to create a moral movement around the occupation. We have a certain power as American Jews that helps to uphold the occupation, and we want to withdraw that power and our consent. So in France, fears of anti-Semitism have overshadowed that clash of values that may otherwise arise. In the question period, I could also explain, if people are interested, how France's national culture of laïcité, or secularism, and the predominance of Orthodox Judaism there has also prevented French Jewish identity from being as intertwined with an overarching national identity as American Jews' identity is with 20th century American liberal political culture. I liken this dissonance leading to a clash of values among predominantly American Jews to the concept of ontological security. That refers to a feeling of security in one's sense of self and confidence in one's capacity to be, to act, and to maintain a stable sense of self, a stable biographical narrative in one's societal and material context. Both physical and ontological security are different ways one can feel safe and stable or anxious and unstable. But ontological security involves a more nuanced and reflexive awareness of the connection between identity and security. In the mid-2000s, political scientists started using this concept as a lens to understand political behavior of state leaders and increasingly minority ethnic groups, and I can go further into that afterward. Each type of insecurity elicits different security-seeking strategies. French Jews' heightened sense of physical insecurity has encouraged solidarity around support for Israel, while American Jews' heightened ontological insecurity from the clash of values I described has elicited, I argue, intra-community fragmentation through greater support for pushback. The main point to take home is that divergent perceptions of insecurity over the last decades have created contrasting pushes and pulls away from and toward more mainstream and pro-Israel advocacy, activism, and lobbying on one hand, and more critical and pro-minority rights activism on the other hand. You could think of it as US-based pushback activists have been pushing on an open door in their appeals to liberal and politically progressive Jews, while pushback leaders in France are providing an identity-affirming function for which there's actually little demand due to an acute and widespread preoccupation with anti-Semitism. So a few minutes ago, I said that in the 2000s, less than 30% of American Jews thought anti-Semitism poses a very serious problem. Well, in March and April of this year, the same reputable and widely cited annual survey by the American Jewish Committee found that 56% of American Jews think anti-Semitism poses a serious problem in the US, and that's up by almost 20% in 10 years. As recently as 2019 and 2022, American Jewish Committee found that 40% of American Jews thought anti-Semitism had increased a lot in the preceding 5 years. But in the spring of this year, so, well into the war, almost 90% of American Jews thought anti-Semitism had increased in the US since October 7th. More than half, so 55% of US Jews said anti-Semitism has increased a lot. So what about attitudes toward Israel? Since October 7, we see a continued pattern of what we've known for at least 25 years. Younger American Jews tend to be more critical of Israel and of US support for Israel. I'll show the difference with a few numbers from recent surveys from Pew and from the AJC in the first few months of this year. 60% of American Jews say it is very important for the US to support Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. 62% think the way Israel is carrying out its response to October 7th is acceptable. So this is American Jews broadly without concern for age. 62% think the way Israel is carrying out its response to October 7th is acceptable. Okay. Now, if we look at Jews younger than 35, only 52% agree, and 42% say it's unacceptable, which is about 10% higher than broadly American Jews regardless of age. Slightly more than half of American Jews broadly have a favorable view of the Israeli government since the beginning of the war. And that figure rises up 20 percentage points, up to 20 percentage points among Jews 50 and older. Whereas less than half of American Jews younger than 35 have a favorable view of the government since October 7th. Whereas 3/4 of American Jews broadly favor the US providing military aid to Israel in the war. Among younger Jews, more than a quarter think the US should not be providing military aid to Israel in the war. And that's more than 10% higher than the figure among American Jews broadly. And finally, almost a third of younger American Jews think that Hamas's reason for attacking Israel is valid, compared to only about 1 in 10 of the general American Jewish population. Since the war began, those push-pull factors that I mentioned earlier have become more salient, and in particular, anti-Zionist and non-Zionist pushback, for instance, by Jewish Voice for Peace and IfNotNow, have become a much larger part of the story of American Jews' activism regarding Israel, especially among younger Jews. And those two organizations have converged quite a bit in their activism after October 7th, including in student encampments. Those images on the left, that's at UCLA, and on the right, that's at Columbia, which we know those were two of the main sites of the most activistic student encampments and violence, and a lot of media attention. So their clear and simple message of anti-colonialism, anti-settler colonialism, anti-apartheid, and anti-oppression resonates profoundly, especially with young adults. And both organizations draw heavily on the saying, "Never again." You could see it on the top of that post by IfNotNow. It says, "Remember the past," and that they have a recurring pattern of idea of never again, as in, we know never again after the Holocaust will there be a genocide, another genocide. So I want to, I have just a few more slides, and I want to summarize the messaging of the most significant across the political spectrum, the most significant Jewish political advocacy organizations which push a foreign policy toward Israel to the United States government. So first, I'll tell you what the messages of AIPAC over the last several months. So what is their narrative of the war? It's that Israel is an outnumbered victim in a multi-front war against Iran and its proxies in Gaza through Hamas, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, in the West Bank through Hamas and Islamic Jihad, in Yemen through the Houthis, and Iran-backed militias in Syria and Iraq. Israel is on the front lines against a global threat to America's interests and democratic values. This is the narrative of the war. AIPAC does not discuss ceasefire. This could be because it would undermine the narrative of this Seven Front War. AIPAC says Israel makes a good faith effort to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza via aid, and it rejects any notion of the US ending military aid and arms to Israel. It considers that any recognition of Palestinian statehood would disincentivize negotiations by sending the message to Palestinians that terrorism and violence pay off and are rewarded. And finally, with the most recent International Criminal Court arrest warrant against Netanyahu and against the recently former Minister of Defense Gallant, AIPAC considers the ICC ruling to be illegitimate, immoral, and politically motivated. What about JStreet? Its messaging is different on all counts. Through regular statements, it expresses broad disapproval of how Netanyahu and the Israeli government has handled the war, and that Netanyahu has shown disrespect to the Biden administration and to international law. JStreet criticizes the Biden administration for failing to rein in Netanyahu's policies and actions, and for failing to enforce American laws that US military aid cannot be used to inflict siege and starvation. JStreet calls for a pause on US weapons to Israel until it stops blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza. It also calls on the US to oppose recent Israeli legislation which would bar UNRWA from operating in Israel and from coordinating with UNRWA in Gaza and the West Bank. So JStreet has urged a negotiated ceasefire to stop the fighting, free the hostages, and increase humanitarian aid in Gaza. It urges the US to recognize Palestine as a state, provided Palestinian leadership meets certain conditions and as part of a broader initiative toward peacemaking. JStreet's response to the ICC's arrest warrants is ambiguous. So let's see what Jeremy Ben-Ami wrote. It is unbearably painful for friends of Israel to read international justices hold that there are reasonable grounds to believe that leading Israeli officials have knowingly and intentionally violated international laws, including the use of starvation as a method of warfare and other horrific crimes against humanity. So JStreet is not denouncing the ICC warrants, you see. Okay, what about Jewish Voice for Peace? It calls itself the world's largest Jewish organization in solidarity with Palestine and in support of the Palestinian call for BDS. It was a major voice in the student encampments over the beginning of this year, last academic year. And it describes itself as anti-Zionist, leftist, grassroots, cross-class, intergenerational movement of American Jews. And it has much smaller counterpart organizations in Canada and France. Okay, so it sees Israel as an ethnically supremacist rogue state whose establishment is the cause of the beginning of Israel's conflict with Arab states and with Palestinians. And its establishment is the cause of violence and perpetuation of those conflicts. It regularly calls Israel's actions in Gaza genocide and its actions in Lebanon terrorism, but it has long called Israel's actions toward Palestinians cultural genocide. How does it depict the attacks on Israel on October 7th? As a terrible product of more than 75 years of oppression and dehumanization of Palestinians. JVP also calls AIPAC, ADL, and other mainstream and establishment organizations major threats to American Jewry. They had a whole campaign a few years ago. JVP and AIPAC had a whole campaign a few years ago calling AIPAC the greatest threat to American Jewry. And since the war, it has amplified its long-term call on the US to end any and all support for Israel. And that picture I have there is a promotion of Jewish Voice for Peace at your campus. That's taken from their Instagram page. I'm particularly interested in standing together. It was founded in 2015 in Israel. It has become very widely recognized across the US and across North America over the last year. It's received significant positive media attention from major newspapers and radio stations. The organization is centered on the idea of Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian partnership. It calls itself a revolutionary movement for profound change, specifically a political and economic restructuring of Israel. This is what it calls for. It says the current Israeli government serves the interests of a small capitalist financial elite and the settlement building political elite. It calls for a political movement to empower a broad coalition of people who form the majority of Israeli, Jewish, and Arab societies. Its message on the conflict is that Jews and Palestinians have a common fate and no one is going anywhere. This and the concepts of justice and equality are what they say are the basis for dialogue and conflict resolution. But it does not propose a concrete resolution per se, as other groups, like for instance, as JStreet, its raison d'etre is a two-state solution. Standing Together doesn't do that. So American support chapters are very careful to not have their own message, but to boost the signal, as they say, boost the signal of standing together in Israel and draw attention back to Israel. What I find particularly interesting is, so support groups in the United States, they don't promote an explicitly leftist and anti-capitalist message. That probably would not resonate nearly as well in the United States. In the US, there's no national strategy for standing together. It is grassroots, and its activists and supporters communicate through WhatsApp. In LA and the Bay Area, no chapters have dialogue group. The chapters have dialogue groups, processing groups, and monthly protests. So I'll just conclude to say that. One reason I find standing together particularly interesting is that I've noticed that JStreet has not resonated as profoundly, has not resonated as much with younger American Jews, in the last many years. And over the last year, JVP, IfNotNow, have become very popular. And I find it interesting that standing together, which is not anti-Zionist, although it doesn't promote a particularly pro-Israel message, is resonating with many American Jews, including many younger, many young adults. And I'm thank you very much for your attention.
All righty, thank you so much, Dr. Stein. I'd like to think about, I'll just start with, I'm going to take advantage of my role here and ask kind of a general question, and then we'll switch. We have a bunch of very interesting questions from the audience. To what extent are these identities or variables, if you wish, dynamic and fluid? Are we talking about a static? Are you expecting this to change over time, given the experience of the past year or so?
What do you mean identities? Do you mean,
for example, the idea of the physical threat or the intercommunal clash of values? Does it change at all? Are these perceptions static? Do they remain the same over time?
So what I was trying to show is that it looks like perceptions of anti-Semitism I was focusing on the United States toward the end. Perceptions of anti-Semitism have increased, okay? Also, certainly anyone can see a clash of values between liberal and ethno-nationalist values, American and Israeli. This is intensified over the last year. What we're seeing is intensified criticism toward Israel, but also this is partly why I find the popularity of standing together so interesting, and I'd like to see where it goes in the next year, because it's only in the last few months that it's become so popular in the United States after their tour. They did a tour at the beginning of this year. The leaders did a tour of American cities.
All righty. We have a couple of questions, as I said, from the audience. In light of the negative view of the Jewish population's own status in France, why does France continue to have the third largest Jewish population in the world? In other words, why is there no mass exodus far beyond the number that you cited, the 45,000 people? In other words, why don't they move en masse to Israel or move somewhere else if the situation is so dire, if it's so difficult, if it's so impossible to live?
Well, many are making Aliyah. In that graph, I think in certain years it peaks at more than 1% that I showed. Many are making Aliyah. Many also return to France on a regular basis. Or they spend half the week in Israel, half the week in France, because it's so close and there's no time difference. But why isn't there a mass exodus? Well, people have their lives and their friends and their jobs, and it's likely that for many their standard of living is higher in France than it would be if they moved to Israel.
All righty.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good one. Another question. In the US-France comparison, we have a Francophile here. What role do you see modern France's geographic and historical proximity to Nazi Germany and Vichy France having? In other words, is there a historical echo here that kind of informs the present mindset, if you like, the zeitgeist of French Jews?
Sure, that's so interesting. So obviously the Holocaust, World War II and the Holocaust occurred in France with the help of Vichy France, okay? But what about France's Jewish population today? Its majority, for about 70% of French Jews, their background is in North Africa, okay? And they immigrated to France in the 50s and 60s from Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. So they have a different experience. They experience the historical memory of the Holocaust in France very differently than, let's say, the majority of Jews in the United States who are of European background. I've thought about where is the intergenerational trauma from the Holocaust greatest? North America, United States, or France? And I think it's very interesting to consider that it's really difficult to compare, because there's a greater share of Holocaust survivors in the United States than there are in France, by sheer virtue of the demographic composition of French Jews. And they had a relatively small share of French Jews were killed during World War II.
All righty, another question here from the audience. Do you think there is a difference among the three countries you've studied in the relationship between religious orthodoxy and support for Israeli policy in Gaza and the occupied territories? Is there a relationship between age and orthodoxy?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so surveys show that there is a strong correlation between orthodoxy and pro-Israel sentiment, okay? And a majority of French Jews identify as traditional or Orthodox in terms of their Judaism, and a majority, I think it's only around 10 to 15% of American Jews identify as Orthodox or modern Orthodox. So, and there's a strong correlation with their with religious proclivity and support for Israel. And I see this as part of my argument about clash of values. So when I say liberal American Jews feel a clash of values with Israel, I mean because liberal American Jewish political culture is so intertwined with 20th century American liberal values: pluralism, respect for minority rights, equality, rule of law. An American Jew's own experience of being a minority. And this really informs their Jewish identity and their political behavior concerning Israel in a way that it doesn't inform the political identity and political behavior of many Orthodox or traditional Jews.
All righty. One other question from the audience. It is clear what the so-called Jewish Voice for Peace stands against, but what does it stand for as far as the Jewish people? And does it recognize any existence of anti-Semitism anywhere?
Yeah, so Eli, in your introduction, before you presented me, you said that a lot of these organizations promote, they really push, so-called Jewish values.
Right.
They push the idea of justice, the idea of equality, the idea of anti-colonialism. They push these values and principles more so than any actual policy. Okay, there are a few policies they push. One of them is end U.S. diplomatic and military support for Israel. But what they really try to do is pull on Jewish values among Jews, and they do recognize anti-Semitism. However, they don't see it as a unique form of discrimination. They see it as part of a broader societal discrimination against. They see it as broadly as one part of societal discrimination against Black people, Palestinians, Arabs. It's not a unique concern. This is my interpretation of, but I'd be interested to know other people's.
No, but so just to push back, so if it's a kind of a normative statement, we are against something, what are they in favor of? Do they offer an alternative vision for the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, for the state of Israel, or is it just rejecting the whole notion of the state of Israel?
They don't offer an explicit, what they would consider an explicit solution, but they do consistently, since day one, promote boycott, divest, and sanctions against Israel.
Yeah. Alrighty, as a policy, as an actual actionable thing
Yeah.
that the university or somebody. Okay, I understand. So let me ask a question about, can you talk about the attractiveness of these organizations, perhaps quantitatively, in terms of, how many people attend their events, or how many people contribute and make gifts, or if there's some indicator that you can share with us in terms of, just to understand the kind of the popularity, kind of the
Yes, if you give me a moment, I'll just pull up a graph that shows some financial data.
while Dr. Stein is looking for that graph, I would like to encourage you all to send more questions. We have a bunch of those that are terrific. Don't be afraid, type those in the Q&A box. We'd be delighted to use those as a basis for our conversation and for Dr. Stein's comments.
I'm sorry, I'll just be another 10 seconds.
No worries, Elizabeth. If you can't find it, I don't want to put you in that position searching throughout your
I'm going to share one of my screens if you just give me a moment. So can you see this graph?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So can you see my mouse?
We can.
Okay. So here we've got just a few. I haven't put in the most recent financial data available is from 2022. Okay, I haven't. So you can see that these are from a few years ago. So for instance, you could see, so this is just, let's look at the United States. If you compare AIPAC so this is average annual revenue over 3 years. AIPAC brought in over $100 million US. So let's compare that to JStreet, which brought in about just less than 10 million.
That's significant.
Yes. So, if I take the average of these establishment organizations, so it's their average of their average annual revenue.
Yeah.
And if I take the average of, these are only a few you could see. If I take the average of these averages, this is, I'm sorry, I forget the exact number. I think it's something like 10 times what this is.
Yeah.
Okay. And when I compare that to the averages in Canada, what the establishment organizations bring in on average is about, it's about over 100 times what the, okay?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's, I hope that is just.
Yeah. This is one very important quantitative indicator, certainly. All righty. If you don't mind, you can turn on your camera, and we have another question from the audience. The viewpoint gulf between younger Jews and not younger Jews is well known. To what extent do you attribute it, and what are the prospects of these younger Jews graduating to less left-leaning views of Israel and Zionism? In other words, is there an option for a kind of a shoehorn kind of dynamics where people are extremely progressive, extremely liberal, avant-garde during their 18 to 35, and then they settle down, they become much more conservative, so almost?
Thanks for the question. So I don't know the answer to this, but social scientists have been talking about that for years, whether it's a question of are these the attitudes of a particular generation that has experienced particular events in their lifetime, or are these the attitudes of people who are younger and they will become older and will feel differently over time?
Yeah. Remains to be seen, as we know. Certainly the generational dimension plays a significant role in everything that has happened on campuses and otherwise since October 7th, 23.
Certainly, this generation is living through a monumental period in Israeli history during, let's say university students today, during a formative period of their life.
Yeah. And can it go either way? Is there kind of an overarching trend in that sense? Do the lessons of the perceptions of insecurity, do they lean towards one side or the other? In other words, do students feel perhaps, are they perceiving security as something that is positive or negative nowadays? Is there a one size fits all kind of explanation?
I don't know, but what I can refer to is maybe some of you in the audience saw a survey that came out less than a year ago by Eitan Hirsch. He looked at Jewish students' responses to Jewish students, feelings of life on campus after October 7th. And he found that Jews were experiencing a social cost to supporting Israel. And that social cost was that some people didn't want to associate with them, or they would, not hide, but not be not flash or not be explicit with their Jewishness or feelings about Israel. So that's very interesting. The idea is that the idea that Jewish students were experiencing a social cost on campus to being Jewish or being Zionist.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there something that is shared or is common among all these organizations, left to right, advocacy, policy, PACs, and so on and so forth? Is there a common thread or a silver lining there?
I could think of putting as much money in politics as they can. It looks like each of these organizations gets bigger as they can do more fundraising and support the people they want to be in Congress.
Okay, and again, if we, I'm thinking about the recent elections just a few weeks ago. Does that corroborate? Does that kind of confront or kind of refute some of the data that we know about young people and the way that they vote about Israel or they think about Israel in terms of, you mentioned the 18 to 35, but at the same time, they voted not necessarily overwhelmingly, but certainly in greater numbers for Trump in this case.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I don't know. And I'd love to learn, I'd love to do research on that and maybe tell you about it on another occasion.
Absolutely. We'll need to have you back. All righty. I see that there are no more questions in the Q&A. All righty, which kind of gives you the opportunity for us to say, thank you so much, Elizabeth Stein, for sharing your research with us and your insights. That was very, very interesting. And as you said, perhaps we need a second event sometime soon after you conduct an additional round of research to unpack some of the other questions. Just a reminder about our next special webinar, Playing by the Rules, Israel's Palestinian Arab Citizens, featuring Sami Smocha, that will take place on Monday, December 2nd at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Thank you so much, Dr. Stein. Thank you so much, members of the audience, for attending. We appreciate you very much. Please see us again next week for the next special webinar. Have a beautiful, wonderful evening. Happy Thanksgiving, you all. Take care.